one of the things that I just love about the conversations with Danielle and Two Trees are the really wildly different, not only perspectives that we come from, but lived experiences, different identities, and even worldviews and cosmologies that we show up with. I grew up in Wisconsin. My ancestors, some came from Germany, Poland, Ireland. Some were fleeing persecution. Others came for the promise of a new kind of life. They were part of the settler colonial wave that settled in Wisconsin and colonized the land and territory that was inhabited by the Potawatomi people around Madison. A lot of my family members were farmers. They were deeply connected to the land, but my parents' generation moved away from a rural existence and into an urban area in Madison. And for this particular introvert, that was particularly challenging. I found myself most of my life able to better relate to some of the winged ones and the ones that have trees than other two-leggeds on the land. And so I spent a lot of my early days exploring little stormwater runoff creeks and building dams in those areas. And was really born into a deeply disconnected sense of what it means to be part of an interdependent whole. Sometime in my early 20s, I met someone who had a job actually as an animal tracker. I didn't even know such a thing existed. This was like really an exciting moment for me because he took me out in the woods and he showed me in the course of a day that it was actually possible to identify tracks of animals that went through leaf litter, deer in particular. And I was a slow learner. It took me most of the day to be able to get down on my hands and knees and actually see those imprints of tracks in leaf litter. And I was living at the time at the edge of a forest where I walked and spent a lot of time, but I didn't think any four-legged animals lived there because I never saw any. And after I learned to see some of these tracks, I remember going back to those woods and I started to see deer tracks everywhere. And I went back and I told this tracking instructor, "You'll never guess what happened in this last week." He said, "What?" I said, "This huge herd of deer just moved into the woods behind my house." And he kind of cocked his head and looked at me and he said, "Really? They just moved in?" And I said, "Yeah, I've wandered those woods for like a year. I haven't seen any of them." And he said, "Is it possible that you might not have been able to actually see the pattern?" And he asked me where I lived, and he told me that actually if you sat on my own porch at dusk every day, that the deer would actually come out of the woods and feed at the edge of my field. And he was right. He knew so much about the land that he could actually tell me much more about the woods that I lived than I could tell or know myself. And so this was actually my own process of beginning to explore what it meant to come back to land, and my own journey related to trying to become even of land and feel some sense of belonging that might replace the deep sense of isolation that had been part of my own experience growing up. Tracking was a big part of that, but it was also about this time that I began to realize how just that practice of tracking, of paying attention, also had the potential to reveal a number of other patterns that I had been really oblivious to. I had grown up with a lot of stories in my own mind about this land, about this country that I was part of, about the successes and the failures that I had had in my life. I had stories that everything that I had gotten in my life were a result of how hard I worked. I was from a very kind of puritanical family that valued persistence above all else. In fact, my dad brags that was the first 3-syllable word that I ever learned was persistence. And so I had this story of my own success having to do with how hard I worked. And it wasn't really until about the same time that I began to discover how so many of my own experiences, the moments when I was able to get what I wanted in life, had so little actually to do with that persistence, and had so much to do with the unearned privilege that I walk around in the world with. I was, through no choice of my own, born into ethnicity that was socially constructed to be called white, which has given me enormous benefits and advantages and privileges that are not available to all people. I was born into a body that is cisgendered, where my gender actually aligns with my sexuality. All of these things giving me enormous benefits and opportunities and privileges. And so I became particularly interested in how understanding these systems and structures of inequity actually prevent our communities, this world, from manifesting its unique potential. And I was getting these messages in a variety of ways. I was studying ecology at the time. And I was learning that my original ideas that I had kind of adopted from learning about evolution and natural selection were really incomplete, right? That species that have endured for hundreds of millions of years on this planet did not just do so by being able to pass on their own genes. They also did so by participating in creating conditions that are conducive for life, right? It's not just enough to care for ourselves. We also have to care for the conditions through which other beings can thrive. And so this has been my own kind of inquiry into this process. Realizing that a conversation about equity and power and privilege can actually never be delaminated from any desire that we might have to create clean water, healthy food systems, land where people can connect to and recreate. If we're not also equally willing to examine our own privilege and examine the underlying structures and systems that have created systems and forms of oppression. If we don't dive into some of those histories that Danielle was describing about that have to do with deep patterns of colonization, eugenics, displacement, these are all part of the varied stories of this place, and failing to acknowledge them fails to give us the opportunity to actually move forward with the work that we do, whether that be land conservation or something else, in a way that attends to those historical patterns. So we had lots of conversations about what is this conversation that we want to have. For me, there's something about trying to get beyond justice, to get beyond equity, and get into the space where we can dream a bigger dream. That is about creating conditions for all to thrive. And I think maybe the last thing I'll just say before I pass the mic is I want to just say what's